So happy you could come along again. We are joined, as always, by Greg Engert, beer director for the Neighborhood Restaurant Group, a James Beard Award nominee, the group including the just-opened Blue Jacket down at Nats Park, also where we are, Church Key, downstairs, Birch and Barley. Greg, it is always good to see you.
Great to see you, too.
What is on tap this week?
So this week is a beer I've been meaning to do for I guess, years now.
Getting close,
been at this
2
for
years.
A while. And it's one of my one of the beers that really got me into the whole beer life in general, if not the beer that did it. It's called Orval. It is from one of the 6 Trappist monastic breweries in Belgium. Of course, there's a 7th in the Netherlands, which is Le Trapp or Koningshoven, and actually there's an 8th now in Austria called Stift Engeltzell, which is I think still working on its Trappist designation, but it's a monastic brewery. Orval is singular for many reasons, but one is it's from this monastery brewery. It's the only beer they release outside of the gates. You know, when you think about like Westmalle, you see the double and the triple. Rochefort, 6, 8, 10. Chimay White, blue and red. Orval has but one beer, and it's not necessarily a strong ale. It's certainly not dark. It's not as heady as many of the other Trappists are. It's actually more reminiscent, redolent of a kind of farmhouse ale or saison. Which makes it really cool. And probably most notably, it incorporates Brettanomyces bruxellensis, which is a specific strain of Brettanomyces, a wild yeast that imparts the kind of funky, earthy, barnyardy notes we associate with so many lambics and so many of the new sour ales that are made all over the world, and particularly in the United States. But this has been happening at Orval since the 1930s. Shortly after it was reestablished as a monastery in 1926. Okay. So we should taste it.
Beautiful color. Yeah. It's very inviting.
And this particular bottle is actually, I deliberately poured us an aged version of the beer. It's actually really cool. If you go to Belgium, you'll see the better beer bars in Brussels, for instance, will have Orval, and then they'll have something called the Vieil Orval. And all Vieil Orval refers to is Orval that they've purchased, and then deliberately aged in-house to dry the beer out and give it a little bit more of a funky character. And so this beer was actually bottled, and Orval is great because they actually put it right there on the bottle.
I love that.
I know, I wish more breweries would. This was bottled in February 29th, so it's almost, I guess, 8 months old at this point, which is really right about the time where it ceases to kind of change any further.
Okay.
So about you'll have the kind of fresh Orval, which is very fruity and spicy and more saison-y, not as dry, and then the aged Orval, which is much drier because there's yeast and a little bit of Brettanomyces still in the bottle, continuing to convert the sugars and dry the beer out over time. As you can see, it still maintains this wonderful effervescent head. A little bit about Orval. It was originally established as a monastery in 1070, but then a little while ago, changed hands, went out of use, came back in, and like most monasteries throughout Europe, was eradicated during shortly after the French Revolution when Napoleon secularized. And then we've talked before about how Westmalle, the monks that would establish Westmalle, left France, went to the Netherlands on the way to America, but then they stayed. Belgium was created in the 1830s as a country, and then the monastery started to brew. So in 1926, this monastery was reestablished, and then brewing commenced a little bit later on, making this beer. And what's also really neat about it is, this is down in the southeast corner of Belgium, in Wallonia and the French-speaking southern provinces of Belgium. And so the beers that were drank at the time when they started brewing here were typically farmhouse ales. So they basically brewed their own saison. And in those days, the beer was naturally funky because of the Brettanomyces, the wild yeast that would have been all over the equipment. And in fact, in the 1950s, a guy named Jean de Clercq, who I've mentioned before, a brewing scientist who helped a lot of the Trappist breweries modernize so they could continue to compete, including Chimay and Rochefort and Westmalle, he went to Orval and commenced a sanitation process that actually cleaned all of the wild yeast out of the vessels. Shortly thereafter, the locals were enraged because the beer didn't have its
what happened?
Character anymore, that kind of wild note. And so they ended up leaving it the same way, still brewing it in a much more modern method in stainless steel, new equipment, things like that, but then reintroducing strains of Brettanomyces later in the process. And one thing most people don't know, I think a lot of people are under the impression that they add the wild yeast into the bottle. They actually don't. They add the wild yeast and let it begin to re-ferment the beer after it's already been fermented with the original ale yeast, but then they centrifuge the beer before they bottle it. And this is a way just to clean it up a little bit, to get a lot of the particulate matter. And basically, it's a type of filtration for the beer, so it has a longer shelf life. And then they reintroduce the ale yeast into the bottle to re-ferment. So you could argue maybe that over the years it's gotten less funky. Certainly, there are those that argue it's gotten less bitter and hoppy, but it's still a world classic.
It's got a nice mild tang to it.
Yeah,
almost
exactly.
Apple-like, or am I dreaming that? Or
No, absolutely.
Okay.
That's exactly what it is. It's like a little
very different
apple-y.
and enjoyable. What would you pair this with?
Well, it's got a dryness, so we have to be a little bit wary of that. Like a little bit of bitterness that comes in, but it's amazing with almost all foods. You could do it with your salads. You can do it with all manner of seafood in Belgium. This is classic with mussels. Yeah. That little bit of bitterness balancing the salt you'd find in mussels. You can do it with clams and crab. I love it particularly with oily fish, with rich, intense fish. Like in this area, we get lots of great mackerel, lots of great bluefish. And I think that little bit of funk and apple note in there is really delicious with that. Trout, salmon, things like that. So to me, this is pretty much a seafood beer.
All right, got a question about beer. What sort of food to pair it with? Send the question along. The email is beeroftheweek@WTOP.com. Greg, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Everyone, please always do drink responsibly, and be sure to bring your thirst next time for another Beer of the Week.